So I just want to say a few things real quick here. First, generally I agree that there is no free will. Um, the way that human beings are situated in the world is such that the environment has a huge influence on our internal dynamics. Um, that's not to say, though, that those internal dynamics aren't in many ways autonomous. It's just to say that there is no controller in the brain. There's no I or ego or willpower that is separate from the body and separate from the environment's influences on the body, which could control the rest of it. And I think this sort of contradicts the idea that there could be this logical intellect which might gain the upper hand and direct our actions. That seems more like, a nice idea, that it would be wonderful if it were possible, but that, when we get down to the actualities of biological existence, that's just not feasible. But putting that aside for a second, just because there is no ego in the brain and therefore no controller of the brain, that doesn't mean we necessarily have to leap to the assumption that everything is determined. And I think if we're going to try to use physical science to back up the claim that everything is determined, that's not a really legitimate argument, because physics says nothing about life, and physical law does not predict life or explain the behavior of organisms. Organisms are a higher level of development, which maybe include physical law in their dynamics, but transcend that law to some extent as well. And so we can't reduce living organisms to the properties of matter, because their organisms are an emergent property of matter, which have new abilities. Just like consciousness and mind and language is an emergent property of life and of the organism that allows for even higher properties to arise. So I agree that there's no free will, but I don't agree that everything is determined. I think even physical science is based more on, unless we're dealing with discrete objects in motion, if we're dealing with the actual world, it's based on probability and statistics. And we can predict where a large amount of particles over time will be. We cannot predict where one individual particle will end up, just like we certainly can't predict how one individual organism's life will play out. We can predict the general welfare of a species, but individuals cannot be predicted. We can only do statistical evaluations. We cannot predict actual entities, the course of the events of an actual entity's life. So you have to be careful there. But I've made other videos where I tried to move us out of this whole context of free will versus determinism into the novelty versus habit model, and I think that gets rid of this dualism that exists when we assume that there is an inside versus an outside, or a free will versus an externally determined environment. That doesn't seem to be how it is, and I think we can agree on that. And so what seems to be required is that we move into, a new framework entirely, instead of just getting rid of the free will half and falling back on the determinism half. We see that that whole breakdown was itself flawed, because it was based on this false dichotomy, or this boundary existing between the inside and the outside, which we're coming to see more and more now is not as, it's more porous than we originally suspected. So I guess if you're interested, I'll post a link to some of the videos I made about novelty and habit up in the description box, and maybe I'll make another video about that later, but for now, that's all I wanted to add. Thanks for listening.